No one arrived in places like this by accident. When a road narrowed into uncertainty, when a map stopped offering clarity and became suggestion, when the wind rose loud enough to drown thought, a person was either running or trying to disappear. Lydia Holt came into the stony valley of Idaho in late autumn of 1890, at a time when even those who knew the land believed the season had already turned against newcomers. The ground had hardened too early, the sky held little patience for outsiders, and the air carried the quiet finality of approaching winter. She arrived with no name that meant anything to anyone there, no letters of introduction, no story that could be told without breaking apart under examination. Her body bore the memory of long travel, of nights slept without rest, and mornings begun without expectation. She had learned, over time, not to ask questions that demanded honesty from people who had none to give. Survival had taught her restraint. Silence had taught her endurance. Her horse moved slowly, each step careful on the frozen ground, as if instinct alone understood how easily a mistake could undo them both. The wind reached for the hem of her coat and pulled at it with persistent curiosity, not violently, but with enough intent to test her resolve. The valley opened ahead of her in muted tones of stone and frost, broad and unwelcoming, stripped of ornament or comfort. It offered no promise except isolation. Exactly for that reason, Lydia had chosen it. Where nothing was expected, she could exist without explanation. Where no one waited, she would not disappoint. Guilt carried less weight in emptiness. She stopped where the land dipped inward, sheltered faintly by uneven rock and a thin line of evergreens. The cabin stood there as if forgotten by time rather than destroyed by it. Its roof slanted unevenly, pressed down by seasons it had endured without repair. Moisture clung to the wooden walls, darkening them into a permanent shadow. The stove inside bore rust and ash and memory, a relic from better years that had not been kind enough to return. To someone passing through, it would have looked like abandonment. To Lydia, it held the essential shape of possibility. She unloaded her belongings one piece at a time, careful not to rush, careful not to tempt rejection. Each item placed inside felt like a quiet request, as though the cabin itself held authority to decide whether she belonged within its walls. She waited for that invisible judgment, listening to the sound of wind through warped boards, to the protesting door that resisted being shut fully. Nothing stopped her. Nothing chased her away. That was more permission than she had been granted anywhere else. As evening settled, the cold deepened. The color drained from the sky until everything softened into gray. She worked until her fingers stiffened and her arms trembled from fatigue. There was no urgency except the one imposed by nature itself. The fire took long to awaken, the first sparks refusing her effort, forcing patience she barely had left. When warmth finally spread, it came slowly, unevenly, touching her skin in brief allowances rather than comfort. It was then she noticed the light on the distant hill, a small glow, steady and restrained, barely perceptible against the darkening land. It was far enough to feel unreal, close enough to stir awareness. Someone lived up there. Someone watched the valley daily and chose not to descend. The presence disturbed her more than true isolation ever would have. It suggested witness without intervention, knowledge without interference. The idea remained with her as the cold pressed inward, long after she turned away from the window. Night brought no rest. She lay beneath borrowed blankets, listening to the cabin settle around her. Every sound announced vulnerability. The creak of wood, the whistle through warped joints, the distant call of something moving beyond sight. These were not threats in themselves, but reminders that nothing here would shield her if she faltered. She did not fear violence. What unsettled her was the sense that her escape had reached its limit. There was nowhere further to go. If this place rejected her, there would be no next attempt. She rose before dawn, stiff with cold and exhaustion, and stepped outside into a landscape transformed by frost. The ground glittered faintly, as if the valley had hardened overnight. Breath condensed in front of her, brief proof of life. The silence was complete enough to feel intentional. She labored through the morning without pause, gathering what little could be gathered, reinforcing what little could be reinforced. Her body moved by will alone, driven by an unspoken understanding that momentum was safety. Stopping invited doubt. Doubt invited retreat. The wind returned by midday, stronger than before, dragging clouds across the sky in slow procession. Lydia worked through it, shoulders hunched, movements deliberate. She did not look toward the hill again, though the knowledge of that light remained. It was easier to imagine herself unseen, unconsidered. It allowed her to focus on the immediate truth of wood and stone and fire. When her hands finally gave out, when the ache overtook caution, she retreated inside and sat in stillness. The cabin smelled of smoke and damp earth. It was not comfort, but it was containment. In that narrow space, she felt the weight of the last months settle into her bones. She had lost more than place. She had lost legitimacy, future, any version of herself that could be described without lowering her voice. Here, none of that mattered. The land did not inquire. The cabin did not judge. Survival was the only qualification. As darkness returned for the second time, Lydia understood the nature of her arrival with calm clarity. She was not passing through. She was not waiting to be rescued or discovered. She had placed herself deliberately where living would require effort every single day. And if she managed it, if she endured what the valley demanded, then her presence would become fact rather than accident. She lay awake again that night, not from fear, but from recognition. The running had ended. What remained was the work of staying. Ilya Rowan woke before dawn out of habit, not necessity. His body remembered the rhythm of work, even when the mind had nothing to anticipate. The sheep needed tending, the winter demanded preparation, and the land required silence. His son asked for nothing anymore. He lived high, where the air thinned and memories sounded sharper. The loss of a child had not arrived like a storm. It had settled like sediment over years, coating every hour with quiet emptiness. Comfort was not sought, not from grief, but from the futility of expecting solace. He noticed Lydia Holt not by sight at first, but by the change in the valley. Footprints in frozen soil, smoke rising in ways it had not before, a subtle disturbance in the stillness. He did not descend to confront her, nor did he send her away. He observed her as one watches lightning from a distance, acknowledging the potential for impact, but silently hoping the storm would pass. Her presence irritated him not through intrusion, but by suggesting possibility. For years, he had arranged his life so nothing depended on another. Now, in the valley, a woman existed who refused to vanish, threatening the fragile order he had cultivated. She carried with her movement, persistence, and an oblivion to the rules he had accepted as necessary for survival. Once, when he left firewood at her cabin, It was unconscious, a gesture with no intended recipient. He expected no gratitude, no acknowledgement. Yet the next morning, the wood had been consumed, the flames crackling with silent acceptance of what he had left behind. He recognized, without confronting it, that her endurance was a statement of will, one that could either complement or shatter the isolation he had built. As the sun crested over the eastern ridge, he returned to his own shelter, eyes lingering on the valley below. He saw her shaping her cabin with quiet persistence, a rhythm both foreign and strangely familiar. He understood that change had arrived without warning, a visitor he had neither invited nor resisted. And in that recognition, something shifted. It was not hope, not yet. It was acknowledgement, the first tremor of a life that had been static for far too long. The days passed in measured repetition. Lydia labored, and Ilya watched, never near enough to intrude, never distant enough to dismiss. He noticed how she paused to study the light through the trees, how her fingers bore the calluses of steady work, how her breaths came and went with the weight of her effort. He did not pity her, nor did he admire her in the ordinary sense. He catalogued, silently, with a kind of wariness that came from having lost more than he could name. As the sun crested over the eastern ridge, he returned to his own shelter, eyes lingering on the valley below. He saw her shaping her cabin with quiet persistence, a rhythm both foreign and strangely familiar. He understood that change had arrived without warning, a visitor he had neither invited nor resisted. And in that recognition, something shifted. It was not hope, not yet. It was acknowledgement, the first tremor of a life that had been static for far too long. The days passed in measured repetition. Lydia labored, and Ilya watched, never near enough to intrude, never distant enough to dismiss. He noticed how she paused to study the light through the trees, how her fingers bore the calluses of steady work, how her breaths came and went with the weight of her effort. He did not pity her, nor did he admire her in the ordinary sense. He catalogued, silently, with a kind of wariness that came from having lost more than he could name. When winter storms swept down the valley, he noticed the way she adjusted her shelter, reinforced the walls, protected what little she had built. And with each act, he saw a reflection of resilience that mirrored his own, though forged in different fires. There was a symmetry to their solitude, a tenuous balance of presence and distance, each aware of the other without acknowledgement, each carrying burdens too private to share. Evenings brought frost across the ridge, and Ilya often lingered at his doorway, listening to the quiet punctuated by her hammering, her footsteps, the settling of logs. No words passed, no confrontation occurred. Yet in the cadence of her labor, he sensed a narrative unfolding, one of survival, defiance, and something unspoken that might, with time, disrupt the walls he had built around his grief. It was not intrusion, nor was it companionship, but a mutual recognition. Two lives intersecting in a valley that had seemed devoid of possibility, each shaping the land, the air, and the silence around them. He understood the fragility of what she carried, the impermanence of the frost, the imperfection of the shelter. And yet he felt a pull, subtle but insistent, toward the presence that refused to vanish, toward the life that demanded acknowledgement, even from a man who had long ceased to expect it. By the end of the week, Ilya's observation had become a ritual. He did not move closer, nor did he signal his awareness. He simply recorded, internally, the details. The way she braced each log, the way her hair caught the sun, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor of exertion when she lifted heavier timbers. He did not speak, did not intervene, and yet he felt the weight of shared existence settle lightly like snow upon the valley floor. Through silence and distance, he was learning the language of her persistence. And in that learning, something delicate began to take root, a recognition that neither solitude nor grief could remain absolute while another presence carved itself into the land beside him. It was not trust, nor was it expectation. It was a cautious acknowledgement, a subtle opening, the first faint outline of a connection neither had sought but could no longer deny. Snow fell abruptly. Without warning, the valley was swallowed under a white blanket. Roads vanished beneath the weight of ice and drift, leaving tracks meaningless and paths impassable. Any rare visitors that might have braved the isolation disappeared, and the valley fell into a silence that was complete, unbroken. For Lydia Holt, it meant that all choices were now irrevocable. There was no longer a way to wait out the storm. Survival demanded presence, endurance, and the acceptance that each day would be measured in small, relentless trials. Her days became a meticulous negotiation with the elements. Fingers numb from the cold, the stove's fire struggling to maintain warmth, exhaustion accumulating faster than sleep could mend it. These were the constants of her existence. Each task, each small act of keeping the cabin functional was a test of persistence. She did not expect help. Experience had taught her that waiting was a form of dependence, a risk she could not afford. Yet, help arrived. Consistently, silently, in moments that seemed too precise to be coincidental. Ilya Rowan appeared with the same quiet inevitability as the snow. He did not enter her cabin. He did not linger. He moved with the precision of a man accustomed to solitude and duty. Yet his presence was undeniable, like the mountain wind or the shifting weight of the frost. Each day, their parallel routines began to align, unspoken and unremarked upon, forming a rhythm that neither sought but both followed. It was not companionship in the ordinary sense. It was adaptation, a mutual acknowledgement of existence in shared space. Tasks overlapped without words. Firewood was stacked and replenished, fences repaired against the pressure of ice-laden winds, provisions moved and secured. Lydia noticed the efficiency of his movements, the way he anticipated needs before they became urgent. She did not look for gratitude or recognition. She merely adjusted her own efforts to complement his, unconsciously syncing with the cadence of a presence that had become both predictable and essential. The valley held its breath around them, the storm isolating their labor from all else. Whispers of the world beyond the ridges reached her occasionally. Fragmented stories carried by the wind or the infrequent traveler suggested life continuing elsewhere. Lives measured by names, reputations, and the small dramas of towns that she no longer inhabited. Names had power there, whereas here in the valley, deeds spoke in silence. She understood the risk of being seen, of being judged by standards she neither acknowledged nor desired to meet. Ilya understood it too, though he chose inaction. He observed, allowed her to exist on her own terms, and intervened only where necessity dictated. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable except for subtle changes in the frost, the gradual accumulation of snow, and the patterns of their shared labor. Lydia became attuned to the minor signs of his presence, the faint track in fresh powder, the carefully stacked pile of split logs, the occasional adjustment of a latch or shutter. Each act was discreet, functional, and devoid of ceremony. She did not expect recognition, yet she felt a quiet reassurance in knowing that another human acknowledged the demands of this place without words. Night brought its own pressures. Temperatures dropped, and the wind's howl against the cabin walls reminded her of the valley's indifference. She prepared for sleep with the same precision she applied to her days, tending the fire, layering blankets, closing shutters against the draft. Outside, shadows shifted in the moonlight, and the snow glistened with a cold brilliance. Ilya's presence, when it coincided with these hours, was a distant certainty. A shape against the ridge, the faint imprint of his path, a reminder that she was not entirely alone. There was a rhythm forming, subtle and unacknowledged. The valley had become a crucible in which endurance and solitude intertwined, shaping a bond neither had intended nor named. It was not friendship, not intimacy, not even trust. It was recognition of necessity, of shared persistence, of survival measured in acts rather than words. And in that rhythm, Lydia felt the faintest trace of stability, a fragile certainty amid the relentless cold, that the presence beside her, steady and silent, might be the only constant she could rely upon. Through the endless white, life continued. Wood was gathered, fires maintained, food stored. Each day was a negotiation with frost and wind, with hunger and fatigue, with the unspoken weight of being observed. Lydia moved with purpose, her labor both defiance and adaptation, while Ilya maintained his distance, leaving traces that quietly bolstered her efforts. And in the harsh clarity of winter, the valley revealed truths that could not be spoken. Endurance, observation, and the quiet, unyielding presence of another who did not intrude but also did not abandon. As the storm persisted, Lydia realized that the valley's silence was no longer absolute. A pattern had emerged, delicate but unmistakable, a sequence of effort, presence, and acknowledgement that required no words to define it. The winter had arrived ahead of understanding, ahead of explanation, shaping lives in its raw, unyielding way. And in that frozen expanse, two solitary figures moved in parallel, each marked by the other's existence, each learning, without speaking, the contours of a life that could withstand the storm. When the representatives of the neighboring landowners arrived at the ranch, Ilya understood that the era of non-interference had come to an end. Their attention was not drawn by the presence of a woman alone on the property, but by the disruption of an established order. Any deviation from the expected routines, any sign of autonomy, was perceived as a threat to a structure where every action was predictable, every consequence known in advance. Ilya listened as they spoke, their words measured, their intent clear without needing elaboration. He did not intervene. His silence was deliberate, a shield forged over years of loss and solitude. The weight of old choices pressed against him, each one a reminder that life in this valley had been built on patience and observation, not confrontation. To support would be to sacrifice the fragile protection he had carved from isolation. To remain silent was to preserve a tenuous peace, a calm he had paid dearly to secure. Lydia felt the pressure tightening around her like a vice. She understood the unspoken judgments, the small, invisible barriers that were being erected against her. The valley, once a refuge, now seemed a stage where every move might be scrutinized, every action weighed. She considered leaving, a motion familiar and instinctive, yet this time it carried a sting. The idea of abandoning the place was no longer simply a matter of survival. She clung to something subtler, an internal measure of worth, a belief that staying required earning a claim not granted by law or neighbor, but by quiet determination. Ilya observed her as she prepared, noting the hesitation, the subtle tension in her movements. In that observation, he recognized a truth he had long avoided. Neutrality is not a passive state, it is a choice. And it is always a choice made at the expense of those less powerful. By not acting, he allowed the pressure to fall where it would, on the one who had least means to resist. He felt the gravity of that decision, a reminder that morality in the valley was not abstract, It was embodied in every decision, every withheld word, every act of measured restraint. The visitors departed with their expectations unmet but unchallenged, leaving the valley quieter than before, yet heavier with unspoken consequence. Lydia moved through the space they had scrutinized, aware of each footprint, each sound, as if the valley itself measured her determination. The price of silence, of neutrality, had been made tangible, and she understood that endurance would now be counted not only in labor, but in the subtleties of courage, when to act, when to remain, and when the world could be allowed to judge without immediate reprisal. Ilya returned to his routines, carrying the same awareness that the cost of non-involvement was a ledger silently kept. The valley demanded choices, visible or unseen, and each day presented new balances to weigh. Lydia and Ilya moved forward in tandem, yet apart, each navigating the pressures of an outside world that measured them by its own unspoken rules. Neutrality had its price, and both felt its weight. A constant gravity shaping survival, endurance, and the quiet assertion of presence. The storm came suddenly and with a force that erased the familiar. Wind tore across the valley, stripping landmarks from memory, while snow buried the trails that had guided even the most careful traveler. Lydia's illness appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, a body surrendering to exhaustion rather than a cry for attention. Her movements slowed, breaths came unevenly, and the everyday tasks she had carried with stubborn independence became impossible. It was not dramatic. It was simply the body's truth laid bare, unavoidable and indifferent to pride. Ilya moved toward her, each step measured, knowing the risks. The sheep needed tending, the cold could claim the vulnerable, and the climb back across frozen slopes promised its own dangers. For the first time in years, he did not calculate the cost. He did not tally the risk to livestock, to his own strength, or to the delicate order he had maintained in solitude. He knew only one certainty. If he did not reach her, there would be emptiness in the valley that no return could fill. He stayed as long as necessary, tending the fire, arranging the blankets, breaking the ice in water troughs, ensuring the smallest tasks of survival were done without fanfare. He worked quietly, with a deliberate restraint, waiting without expectation. Care was an act, not a promise. The storm outside and the storm within the cabin became indistinguishable, a world reduced to essential truths. In that stillness, fear of witnessing someone else's weakness dissipated. He was no longer just a witness to life, nor Lydia merely a solitary figure enduring in silence. Their shared labor and presence wove a new rhythm, subtle but unbreakable. Hours passed, measured in breaths and the slow melting of snow against the roof. When the storm finally relented, leaving the valley cloaked in white and silence, the landscape seemed altered, unfamiliar yet serene. The work of surviving it had changed them both. It was not spoken in words, but in the quiet acceptance of need and the unspoken acknowledgement of presence. Neither was temporary anymore. Neither could return to the pretense of isolation. They had crossed a boundary where solitude was no longer an option, and in that crossing, something fragile and enduring had taken root. The valley remained silent around them, but the silence now contained a shared pulse. Footsteps in the snow, smoke rising from the chimneys, the faint creak of timber settling in the cold. These became marks of life endured together. Neither spoke of what had passed, nor of the relief it brought. The change was internal, a measured understanding that the world could be endured differently when another person's strength was intertwined with one's own. When they moved again through the snowbound hills, It was not as two isolated presences, but as a singular rhythm flowing through the valley. The boundary had been crossed, and the solitude of years had been replaced with a quiet certainty that neither would traverse the storms of life alone again. Spring arrived without fanfare, bringing not relief, but a slow, deliberate steadiness that settled over the valley. The snow melted in quiet increments, revealing patches of hardened earth that had been dormant through the long winter. Green pushed cautiously through the thawing soil, tentative and watchful, as if testing the endurance of those who had remained. The cabin stood resolute against the lingering chill, its walls strengthened by hands accustomed to labor and careful attention. Every repair, every stroke of care placed upon the building was a testament not to permanence, but to perseverance, to the quiet understanding that survival required both diligence and patience. The farmyard thrummed with a subtle rhythm that only those who lived it could perceive. The animals moved across fields that were slowly softening, their breaths misting in the morning air, their hooves pressing into mud that still held traces of frost. Tasks once insurmountable in winter became manageable, measured by the careful cadence of work rather than urgency. Water was drawn and stored, fences were repaired, gardens were tended with deliberate care. Each act of maintenance, small and silent, reinforced the fragile security they had forged together. They did not speak of their commitment, nor did they acknowledge it with words. It existed as a living proof of presence, visible in the steady routines, the shared burdens, the unspoken agreements that bound them without naming the bond. The locals who had once whispered, who had watched from distant hills and ridges, adjusted to the reality of their presence. Acceptance was not heartfelt, nor was it voluntary. It was simply a concession to persistence, to the obvious fact that Lydia and Ilya were not passing through, that their work and care had woven them into the valley itself. Lydia was no longer a rumor, no longer a figure to be speculated upon. She had become part of the landscape, a presence that could not be ignored, a fact as enduring as the stone outcrops and the hardy evergreens. Ilya no longer moved like a shadow, wary of observation or judgment. He was as tangible and inevitable as the morning sun or the thawing river, a quiet presence that signaled endurance more than companionship, and yet, through that endurance, offered protection, understanding, and a subtle constancy that neither had sought, but both had come to rely upon. Together, they had not built a family in the conventional sense. There were no declarations of love, no promises etched in fleeting moments. What had emerged was something quieter, stronger, almost invisible, yet undeniable, a shared rhythm of life where presence was enough, where caring was acted out without expectation, where protection was given as naturally as the earth returns spring growth after the thaw. Love, if it could be called that, was not spoken. It was in the splitting of wood, the tending of the garden, the attention to the animals, the silent acknowledgement of labor and endurance that carried the weight of both survival and companionship. Each day, measured not by hours but by tasks and necessity, reinforced the bond between them, weaving it into the fabric of the valley itself. The passage of time brought not drama or declaration, but clarity. Every storm survived, every challenge met, every hardship endured in tandem strengthened the quiet certainty that neither would leave. They moved through the days and weeks with unspoken understanding, their lives entwined in ways subtle yet profound. The valley, once a testing ground for solitude and endurance, had become a sanctuary, not built of walls or fences alone, but of steady presence, of patience, of shared resilience. The land itself seemed to acknowledge this change, softening under their care, flourishing where attention had been constant, responding to their steady influence with tender blooms and tender green shoots that hinted at a lasting season. Occasionally, Lydia would pause on the ridge near the cabin, looking out over the valley with an eye trained by solitude and experience. She felt the rhythm of life around her, the invisible ties that bound them to this place, to each other, and to the work that defined their existence. Ilya, often at a distance but always nearby, mirrored this quiet vigilance, their movements harmonizing in a way that had become almost instinctive. They did not need words to confirm what had been forged between them. The days themselves spoke. The land itself bore witness. Love in this valley was not a flourish of words or a gesture marked by ceremony. It was enduring presence, steadfast action, and the silent acceptance that life shared, without the need for justification or explanation, could carry its own proof of devotion. It was in this steadiness that they found both safety and a form of intimacy that neither had known before. They had endured storms, isolation, and the relentless passage of seasons together. They had done so without expectation, without promise, and yet the result was a bond that neither could sever, a quiet testimony to the human capacity for patience, endurance, and connection when life is lived in deliberate, shared rhythm. If you are drawn to stories of slow choices, of people discovering one another not through urgency but through patience, through the subtle truths revealed in silence and endurance, subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales. Here, stories unfold without shouting, without demand, and yet linger long after the words have ended. They remain in memory, in thought, in the quiet understanding that what endures is often unseen, but no less real. The valley had changed with them, and they with it, marking the beginning of a new season, not of beginnings, but of persistence, presence, and a bond built to last.